we're taking a break from $150 plus case reviews to look at something more reasonably priced. This is Corsair's 275R. It's an $80 case with the tempered glass version, or $70 for the acrylic, which more or less becomes a 270R at this point, the predecessor to this case. So the main changes from the 270R, which we've actually previously given an Editor's Choice Award and have recommended several times, the changes primarily are tempered glass, of course, natural progression of the industry, vertical GPU mount is available, there's a changed front panel, and that's most of it. There are a couple other changes we'll go through as well, but those are the major ones. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our coffee lake temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. Let's go over the basics and then we'll get through the gripes and the good stuff as well, along with thermal and noise results. First of all, basics. If you liked the 270R, this is one of those, just with glass. There are some other changes, as I noted. One of them is the power supply shroud. It now fully covers the bottom. That changes some of the airflow dynamic, as we'll find in the thermal section. And there's rubber grommets as well. So that's most of the changes. In terms of cooling, it has two fans. They're both 120s. They are located front center, middle slot here. It splits between the CPU and the GPU, and then the rear exhaust. And there are options for an additional 120 at the top, 120 at the bottom, and some slots in the top for cooling as well. So that's all the cooling. Very basic. Now I've been holding this Allen key, and I've been dreading this moment because we need to open the case to take a look at the rest of what's inside of it. And Corsair's gone with Allen screws. Now, I'm no foreigner to Allen keys. I build bikes. Literally every screw on a bike is one of these. So I don't have a problem with them where they belong. I don't know why they're on a side panel of a case though, and there are 4 of them. So what we're gonna do before progressing, I'm gonna take this panel off, we're gonna speed up the footage, and then we're gonna talk about the process. That's my favorite part of the case. We'll talk about that more in a second. Okay, got it. Sorry, that took a while. So that's the side panel removal process. Basically, the problems I have with this case primarily revolve around that. And it's not a bad thing to have your primary concern be 4 screws, because you're probably taking it off once or twice, I guess. And that's hopefully the last time you'll have to deal with it. It's not the most egregious thing we've seen in case design in the last year, but it's annoying. And let me give you the reasons why. Reason number 1, these rubber grommets, 2 of which just fell out. I mean, we recorded the process. All I did was unscrew them. And yes, I could have held the glass in place, but even if you do that, these rubber grommets will fall out because they just kind of sit in there and they're only pressure fitted by the screws themselves. So there are 4 grommets, they fall out, it's very annoying. It's even more annoying to put them back on the glass and then put the glass on the case. And this is something Corsair's done in the past with other cases, so I'd like to see a better solution to these grommets that fall out so easily. Secondly, typically with glass panels on cases, you have 2 primary solutions to mounting them. One of them is something that Thermaltake does, of all people, where they hook on the bottom just with plastic or whatever material they're using down on that part of the case, steel or plastic. It's just a hook. And so when you release it, the glass leans at a 30-degree angle. So that's a good solution. Another solution that Corsair's even done in the past, I think including one of the recent cases, is use standoffs. So you can use standoffs in these 4 corners, and actually we tried to put case standoffs in there. They're not the right thread. But that's another good solution too, and then you get rid of this problem as well. So there are solutions to these problems, and they're not being used, and I don't understand why. On top of all these other side panel and mounting complaints, the tempered glass panel is just slightly longer than it is tall, so it's easy to get halfway through the reassembly process and realize that it's on sideways. So overall, not the easiest thing to put on or take off the case. We asked why Allen keys specifically, or Allen screws, were used. for the glass. And the phrasing of the question was more or less, why not thumb screws? The answer to that from Corsair was because they don't want, or they're trying to avoid users getting fingerprints on the glass when removing a thumb screw. Now, a couple points here. One of them, unless you're a gorilla, removing a sufficiently fat thumb screw, we'll call it the SFT coefficient for thumb screws, a sufficiently fat thumb screw, unless you're like a monster when you're trying to remove it, you shouldn't be making contact with the glass in the process. Secondly, that doesn't answer the question of why Allen? Why not Phillips? And again, I don't have a problem with Allen keys. I have a problem with these screws specifically and how long they take to remove. Now, I could go get my own tool, but that wouldn't be what the user would be doing. That's not the biggest issue, though. The biggest issue is just like, it's kind of just like oversight in general, because rubber grommets fall off as soon as you remove the panel falls off the case. It's overall clumsy and doesn't make sense because Corsair themselves have made far better cases and panels on things equally priced. So I don't get it. I'm just confused. But that's the panel. We don't need to talk about that anymore. The rest of the case is not that bad. So they have a white and a black or gunmetal version. Pretty standard. The white overall is a good color. White is notoriously difficult to color match. So matching plastic and metal is difficult enough, but Corsair specifically is dealing with kind of, I don't know, it looks like they're trying to simulate a brushed aluminum design on the front almost, which makes it even harder to match. It's pretty close. It's close enough to not be like something to really call too much attention to, but it is slightly off. Not a big deal in this case. They've done better than a lot of white cases we've looked at. You can see some of the primer actually on this side. I can see primer still, or whatever the underlying plastic material it is. I don't know if they prime it, but either way, it's it's clearly an unpainted plastic basically. So some quality control stuff there, nothing really major. You'll never look at that part of the case. Once it's on the floor, you're not going to see it. Not a big deal. For the front of the case, it's pretty easy to access, which is always a good thing. It's just a pull on the panel like usually. So we like that, of course. Pretty simple, though. There's a good dust filter right here. Generally easy to access. The other Corsair case we just looked at, the 500D, which is way more expensive, has those nice side pull filters. But for an $80 case, that's pretty standard. Nothing too special there, but nothing that they've done wrong. So we like that overall. I guess I'll mention as well, there's an LED here too. And we actually liked the way this was implemented. So it's not like the SilverStone one where you get the underglow logo. It's just underglow in general. It's just I think it's just a white LED, and it connects via cable just to the front I/O or the top I/O. So you don't need an extra cable for the LED, which is great. This is a problem on some cases where you end up with a lot of extra cables just for some aesthetic LED. So you think about it, there's zero reason that an LED needs to take up an entire slot on a motherboard somewhere or a Molex connector. They don't draw that much power. So Corsair, job well done here. We like that it's integrated with the I/O PCB, so it's all nice and clean and the user doesn't have to do anything or take up motherboard slots with it. We liked that. On the interior, the 275R is functionally identical to the 270R, which is a good thing. We like the 270R. It's functionally identical though, not literally. We tried switching the 275R's tempered glass onto the 270R, but the chassis is slightly too big. The cable cutouts now have rubber grommets and well-placed cable tie points around them on the 275R, and the power supply shroud now extends the full length of the case, but otherwise it's fairly similar. The cutout in the shroud for the GPU power cables is a feature we'd like to see more often and one that we like a lot. The interior features the direct airflow path TM cooling, which is apparently a trademarkable phrase that relates to not having drive cages in front of the fan. But I mean, you can have direct airflow path insofar as the panel, I guess, not allowing it. But their version of direct airflow path means there's no stuff here in the hard drive cage area. it doesn't mean a literal direct airflow path like straight into the fan and straight into the CPU. But whatever, it's just marketing. So overall, we do like the interior layout of the case. There are the usual two 3.5-inch drive sleds situated in the bottom under the power supply shroud, pretty standard these days. And there are also two 2.5-inch SSD mounts on the back of the motherboard tray, so you can fit a total of 4 drives. And then, thankfully, the 3.5-inch cage is also attached by screws rather than being riveted, which is another problem we have with a lot of cases. And the screws, of course, can be removed. So if you need more space for a longer power supply, or cables are just getting messy and you're not using a hard drive, you can get rid of the cage pretty easily. Before getting into the thermal section, first some discussion on the 270R versus this case. This is basically a refresh. It's in the same family. They've added 5 numerically to the value. So it's obvious it's a refresh, and that's fine. It has tempered glass. It's made some other changes that we actually do like quite a bit. It's made some changes, obviously, that we don't like, but that's the nature of any product revision. Now, in terms of thermals and other differences, acoustically, there's not really going to be any difference because they're still the 2 fans that are basically the same specs, spin at the same RPMs with the same front panel situation, more or less. Thermally, there are differences in some tests. And to give you an idea before getting into the charts of why they are different, keep in mind that the front panel is significantly different on the 270R, where there are mesh guidelines on the front sides, and it's a different size, different depth, and a different angle of intake for the panel. So this swoop on the side is slightly angled. And then more importantly, the power supply shroud, again, is longer on this case. That will impact GPU thermals. Additionally, as a small note, the 270R has a grill in the front of its short terminating power supply shroud, which also impacts thermals. So you will see differences between the 2 cases, despite being basically the same family, the same fan configuration, and the same layout internally. We went overboard with the additional tests this time, again, but it couldn't be helped. Our initial plan was just to test the stock configuration, an additional 140mm intake fan, and vertical GPU orientation, which would make 6 test runs, along with our 3D Mark and Blender tests. When we installed the 140 fan, though, the resulting temperatures were higher than they had been before. Fitting the extra fan into place required moving the stock intake fan down slightly, but logically there should have been more airflow across every component. Retesting showed the same results multiple times. Our theory is that in the stock configuration, 1 intake, 1 exhaust, our CPU tower cooler independently pulls cool air in through the large top vent in the case. Adding the 140mm Noctua fan in front of the CPU cooler created a positive pressure inside the case, which meant that the cooler would now receive air only from the intake fans, as opposed to drafting it independently through the top vents, which were only a couple inches away from the CPU tower fan. Because of the extremely closed-off front panel, the intake fans probably recirculate some warm air from inside the case, raising the CPU temperature. To verify this, we did more tests with the top vent taped shut, and by the time we were done with everything, we'd done more than 12 test runs and figured it out, though. Starting with the 275R only for torture testing, our CPU torture test averaged 55 degrees Celsius over ambient for the CPU temperature with the stock configuration. Taking the front panel off lowered this to 50.2 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, as expected, and that's not the worst delta for a panelist test that we've ever seen, so really not too critical here. A couple degrees, 5 degrees is certainly decent, but it's not like 10 as we've seen on some other cases. Corsair's panel isn't as much of a limiter as its stock fan configuration is here, but it certainly isn't helping. As mentioned before, adding an extra fan actually raised this temperature to 58.8 degrees delta T over ambient in one test and 58.9 degrees in another. We saw consistency. We knew that taping the case shut would make temperatures warmer overall, but if our theory was true, it would flip the order of results and the test with an additional fan would be cooler. Taping the top shut in stock configuration raised CPU temperature from 55 to 61.4 degrees. With the extra fan in place, taping the top shut had barely any effect, and the temperature only grew or increased by 0.1 degrees over the stock test. That's well within margin of error. A vertical GPU orientation also resulted in a 58.8 degrees Celsius delta T, with warm air dumped out of the GPU cooler and into the CPU above, partly radiative heat off the backside and partly the open face design, spewing air into the glass. So before we get into the comparative chart for CPU thermals, just to make that perfectly clear, basically what we found with our very specific configuration, this is not universally true. Case testing is the least scientific of all testing because there are a million variables. So with that said, with our specific configuration, a 140mm fan here didn't really help anything for CPU thermals. And we strongly believe that the reason for this, after taping off the top and doing additional validation runs, is that the CPU tower cooler is so close to this top vent that it's able to just pull air in through the outside and shoot it out the back as expected. When we put the Noctua fan here, what's happening is the pressure going into the case now exceeds the pressure going out of the case. We have a positive pressure setup. The air from the front is partly coming out of the top on its own, and some of that's making it to the CPU cooler. The CPU cooler is no longer drawing air externally. That's our hypothesis. Additionally, we believe that the open face cooler on the card, spoken from experience, is pushing some of its warmed air into the power supply shroud. We've found that these shrouded cases do have the impact of increasing GPU temperature. It pushes its air into the shroud. That air will get recirculated because it has to get out of the case. And unless it's getting out through the minimal amount of cracks in the I/O covers in the back, or the expansion slot covers, what it's doing ultimately is getting pulled back up through the CPU fan and pushed out the back of the case. So that's what we think is happening. Comparatively, for CPU temperature, 55 degrees Celsius is approximately what CPU temperature was in the 270R with the case fans running at 1050 RPM, but running them at full speed, like we do with all of our stock tests, that lowered the temperature in the 270R to 52.8 degrees. The 275R and 270R are not significantly different in thermal performance from one another generally, but when we increase the fan speeds to max on each, we are seeing some difference, and the fans do run at the same RPM spec. The View 71 and S340 Elite are also around this temperature range, but the similarly priced Meshify C and cheaper plastic-sided Redline 06 are both cooler. GPU temperature was 57.1 degrees in the torture test, with a best case delta T of 53.3 degrees with the front panel removed. As with the CPU, adding an additional fan, it raised the temperature to 57.8 and 58.4 in two tests. Although the increase is smaller and therefore less conclusive, existing within error margins, there is somewhat of an increase that we saw a couple of times. With the top taped shut and in stock configuration, GPU temperature actually dropped to 55 degrees, exiting the margin of error. And that establishes that the pressure patterns in the case with our specific cooler and video card created the behaviors we saw elsewhere. Temperature also increased back to 58.1 degrees Celsius within margin of error of stock baseline, with the additional fan added back in. GPU temperatures are already difficult to compare thanks to frequency boosting, but there are also some very specific airflow and pressure patterns at work here, and they're affecting results in some ways that are very subtle. What we can say for sure is that our system is behaving in a way that is influenced by the pressure almost more than that extra fan, and that's going to depend on which fan you use as well, naturally. Mounting the GPU vertically resulted in a comically high temperature of 69.7 degrees Celsius over ambient, which was almost a welcome return to sanity. No matter what, vertical GPU mounts suck for open-face cards. Accounting for ambient, that puts us into the 90s, and GPU throttling hits hard at 84C, and again at 60 degrees Celsius, so we're well above both of those numbers. Comparatively, the baseline 57.1 degree measurement is much warmer than the 270R's 51.6 degrees, and more comparable to the PureBase 600's best result or the Inwin 805i. It's on the warm end of the chart, definitely, but doesn't cause the runaway thermals we see with, for example, vertically mounted GPUs. Corsair's previous case is performing better for our configuration with GPU cooling, which we believe to be a factor of the front panel changes primarily and the very significant power supply shroud change, elongating it, and the latter is more likely to impact GPU performance most heavily. The 275R landed at the high end of our 3D Mark results with a GPU temperature of 60.1 degrees Celsius. That's in between the BitPhoenix Enso and Fractal's two C-series cases, which ship with a similar fan layout. Cases with full shrouds that rely on a single intake fan to push air above and below the GPU tend to do poorly with GPU cooling in our tests, but a case like the Meshify C can scale up performance with additional fans better, because it does have that mesh front, despite being not perfectly flat. Rendering with Blender on the CPU temperature during the test was 39 degrees Celsius. That's average, equal to the Dark Base Pro 900 and between the KL07 and H500P, neither of which were cases we praised for cooling. The Meshify and Define C cases were slightly warmer than the 275R here. Rendering on the GPU temperature during the test was 29.6 degrees Celsius. That's close to the Define R6, a case with one more fan, but it's also pretty close to the H500P and stock Meshify C again, but cooler than the stock Define C for once. And finally, for noise, 37.4 dBA is on the same level as the Spec 04 and 270R with the stock fan configuration at max speeds, both fellow Corsair cases with 120mm front-mounted fans. The front panel may be sealed, but it's still made of thin plastic with open gaps on either side. More fans added to the front of this case means more air trying to rush through those narrow gaps, which also means more noise. Like the SilverStone PM02 that we just reviewed, the Corsair 275R needs to justify its existence against its own predecessor. This is a matter of Corsair battling themselves, as SilverStone just did. For the 270R, in the conclusion of our review, what we said was this: based on its $60 to $70 price point and assertive posture against nearby competition, we awarded it an Editor's Choice Award, and we went on to use it in our November budget build in 2017 and accidentally in 2016 as well, both years. We didn't mean to use the same case, but we did because the value was really good, and 2017 it was down to $50. And even now, it's 60-ish. This case is $80. The acrylic version is $70. The acrylic version changes even less, obviously, than this one does from the 275R. The change at that point is this. It's not even just this. It's this. It's the whole. What you're getting for $10 more is less plastic, basically, or metal meshing or whatever. Other than that, it's relocated I/O and a slightly longer power supply shroud. These are not things that you spend extra money for over the 270R, which is still a great case. We still recommend it highly. So all that said then, where does the 275R stack up? Well, Corsair has a history of dropping their case prices slowly over time, as most companies do, and over the course of the next year, we wouldn't be surprised to see this case fall by another $10. If it does, it has now become the 270R. And if that case stops production or maintains the same price, it'd be worth buying one of these, I suppose. But at $80 for the tempered glass version, there are a lot of cases in that price range that can boast tempered glass now, if that's what you really want. So this is becoming a trend now with our last few reviews for cases. Basically, what it comes down to is how much do you like the look of this case versus other cases in the same price range. If you have your heart set on this case and you really like it, there is nothing comically bad about it like with other cases we've reviewed in the past year. It's not bad. The case itself is fine. It has a few things we didn't like. Obviously, the tempered glass can be the butt of a joke, but realistically, you're not removing the glass that much. As much as I hate the way it's installed and detest the choices to use the screws and the grommets they did, it's not that big of a deal. So playing it up, yes, but that's not a big deal. So then ultimately, there's nothing terribly wrong with it. The cooling's not great. It's okay. If you're building an $80 case, you're probably building it with budget components. You're not worrying about a 1080 Ti's worth of heat. You're not worrying about an 8700K's worth of heat. So you have less thermal concern in that department, which means that this configuration may well be fine for the system you're building. If you're building something that is higher end, then probably add fans to it. Just know that with any case that has a panel like this, obviously you're going to run into limitations. But this case is just fine. So that's kind of the trend lately. It's okay. We'd like to see it cheaper. It's odd that Corsair is competing against their 270R in some ways because it is really a good case at its price, and that's why it's good. The 270R is specifically good because of its price. This loses that. So at $80, we wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you really like it, in which case it's fine. Don't feel bad about buying it. But if you want to look at other options, there are things that do everything a little bit better. The RL06, once again, is the best cooling in its class and is actually a little bit cheaper. Just realized that. It's like 10 bucks cheaper. The other options, Corsair's own 400C. If you're willing to spend about $10 more, that's a great case. It works pretty well thermally from our testing. It has some build features and ease of installation features we liked a lot, and it's just a bit more expensive. There are plenty of other options as well. We had them in the charts if you're interested in them, or check Patrick's written review in the article below, where we'll have a couple of extra discussion points on this case and its competition. So that's all for this one. Basically, it's okay. And, subscribe for more. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one. This is the GN 10-year anniversary edition shirt. And I'll see you all next time.